Has Daniel Andrews tried one power grab too many? Judging by the deafening chorus of opposition to his extreme state of emergency legislation, the only answer can be yes. If passed, and they've just passed the Victorian lower house a couple of moments ago, these laws would vest the Premier with the power to unilaterally declare a pandemic, and they could see ordinary Victorians thrown in prison for as long as 2 years for failing to wear a face mask. The President of the Victorian Bar Association, Christopher Blandard QC, says the bill authorises virtually unlimited interference, he says, with the liberties of Victorian citizens. He says, and I quote, "This represents the biggest challenge to the rule of law that Victoria has faced in decades." For more on what this legislation could mean for ordinary Victorians, let's bring in another eminent Victorian barrister, Mr. Paul Hayes QC. He joins me now from Melbourne. Thank you for your time, Paul Hayes. Let's get into some nuts and bolts here. Why is Daniel Andrews, why is this legislation giving him the power to unilaterally declare a pandemic such a bad idea?
Well, Peter, in our Westminster system of government, it's very important that the checks and balances that operate on the executive to ensure that that power is carefully and responsibly exercised are in place. Under this new bill, those checks and balances are absent, and so it effectively gives the Premier and the Minister for Health pretty much unbridled power to do as they wish once the Premier declares a pandemic or makes what's called a pandemic declaration under the proposed bill.
What I don't understand is the haste with these provisions, the lack of scrutiny. I just mentioned to my viewers, Paul, that's passed the lower house in the Victorian Parliament already. It was only introduced not even 48 hours ago. And of course, if it was a federal piece of legislation, there would be considerable months spent on a Senate inquiry, submissions from people like you and the Bar Council. That's not happening here. And it also has some really serious prison terms and heavy fines associated with it too that seem out of step with the actual crime of not wearing a face mask.
That's right. There are two things you raised there, Peter. Firstly, what's truly a worry is the way in which this bill is trying to be rushed through Parliament. There is no urgency for this. Even Liberty Victoria makes the same point, that the bill should be carefully considered by all stakeholders in a very careful way. Indeed, for many, the first time people who had an interest in the bill and these various groups that are normally called upon to comment was yesterday when the bill was tabled, although there was floating around in the ether a copy of the draft bill, but not officially produced to any of these organisations. And what's important is the devil is often in the detail with these bills. The bill is 113 pages long. It's a significant body of legislation. And so to rush it through without any of the interest holders having an opportunity to fairly and squarely consider what it means for citizens and Victorians here in Victoria, you have to raise the question, what's the hurry? Secondly, it highlights, and as you quite rightly touch upon, it carries significant penalties for individuals who are the subject of various directions made under a pandemic order, that if you breach those directions, now it's unclear on the bill, but it could be anything from whether or not you're attending a protest or alternatively to not wearing a mask. You are vulnerable, whether or not it happens or not, it's another thing, but you are vulnerable to the imposition of a 2-year prison term or some very substantial fines, up to $90,000 for individuals and $450,000 for businesses. This is a bill which imposes substantially on the rights of citizens. And because of the very heavy way in which it does so, then I ask the question rhetorically, why not have sufficient time for all of the stakeholders to carefully analyse the contents of the bill and give feedback to the government to take that on board so that it's not an overreach and it operates fairly in balancing between what a government has to do in managing a response to a pandemic, but also, very importantly, preserving the very important civil liberties and freedoms that we're all entitled to enjoy as citizens in a democracy such as Victoria.
And of course, I might add too, Victoria has an Equal Opportunities Act, it has a Human Rights Charter, and they're all put aside by provisions in this draft law. The Premier, when he's pushed on it, in the media, he's saying nothing to see here. Indeed, that was the line today. Let's have a listen.
What we're doing here is putting in place the most transparent, the clearest set of rules to keep Victoria safe. Modelled on New Zealand, modelled on New South Wales, modelled on other Australian states.
Now, there's a tiny little bit of New South Wales in there, sure, but nothing draconian. But pointing to New Zealand is sort of a false premise. New Zealand's a country, not a state. This is a state response. I'm just concerned that as of Friday night, Victoria opens up substantially. He's just hoping people don't notice this, Paul. I mean, how can people speak out on this?
Well, we're speaking out, and obviously many lawyers are speaking out on this now that we've had an opportunity to start reviewing the bill. But one of the really interesting things that fell from the Premier this morning is to say that essentially it's transparent and nothing to see here. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's nothing like. Might have been modelled on what's happening in New Zealand or New South Wales, but and for all intents and purposes, it might look like it in a lot of respects, but it misses the very important element that's present in those two jurisdictions, and that is a degree of parliamentary oversight. Here, there is no cross-party committee within Parliament that oversees this piece of legislation. In fact, what you have is the somewhat Orwellian sounding, I'll read it out, the Independent Management Pandemic Advisory Committee, which is said will comprise a group of medical specialists, human rights experts and community representatives. I'll pause there. Isn't that what Parliament is? Supposed to be where our community representatives are. But nonetheless, it'll be comprised of all of these people. The government of the day will be appointing them, so you'd have to be naive to think that anyone appointed to this committee wouldn't be sympathetic to the government of the day's political objectives. And then, notwithstanding, irrespective of what that committee might advise or recommend to the sole decision maker, the Premier, in decreeing whether or not there is a pandemic declaration, the Premier or the Minister for Health with a pandemic order can simply ignore that advice. They don't even have to follow it. So there is, when you look at accountability, there is nothing at all comparable between what's happening in Victoria under this proposed bill and what's happening in New South Wales. Much more stringent checks and balances on the exercise of that power by an elected official in New South Wales than there is here in Victoria.
Well, Paul Hayes, thank you for your time. It's alarming, but all credit to you and the Bar Council for speaking up and being a voice to so many Victorians who I know are very concerned, even if half of what they heard eventuates. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Peter.